Coming up, an anti-pesticides network discovers dangerous chemicals in drinking water across Europe. The scale of the problem and efforts to purify the system.
There's no real way to get rid of it all, is there?
Well, it's a difficult question to reply.
We talk about what extreme heat can do to the human body.
When you get to a temperature close to 37 degrees and a very high level of humidity, then you reach a point where you cannot cool down, no matter what you do.
And there are more reasons now than ever to be afraid of climate change.
I threw blankets over both the kids, and then I just kind of got over them.
We are now seeing more cases of malnutrition.
We define eco-anxiety, where this psychological phenomenon is most common, and why.
In the way I described it, climate anxiety was substantially more in those countries where the lived experience was likely to be higher. So largely what I would describe as global south countries.
Esto no se lo deseamos a nadie, estamos viendo una situación.
Just 2 degrees is on. Now.
So wherever you have food insecurity, you have a heightened degree of potential mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, suicide, etc.
In the mid-18th century, machines driven by fossil fuels began replacing manpower on a large scale. Some studies say the global temperature started to rise as early as the 1810s, but it's in the past 50 years that the signs have become most evident, particularly in recent years. Summer heat has become more severe, drought a more regular problem, particularly near the equator, and tropical storms have grown more powerful. It's hard to deny human-induced climate change is a crisis. Every month from June 2023 to June 2024, the average temperature across the globe rose above pre-industrial levels. And according to the UN's Copernicus Climate Change Service, that average was 1.64 degrees Celsius. Are we ready for further rise? Can we tolerate it? I called up the Institute for the answer.
How much heat from the sun can a human tolerate, and does tolerance depend on where you were born and raised?
Well, it's a good question, and I think there are two elements to the answer. So on the one end, there is indeed an element that depends on where you were born and raised, and what is cold or is considered cold for a Northern European is probably not the same as what is considered cold for someone who maybe was born in Nigeria or in India. That's normal. It's just a cultural, but there is a physiological adaptation of our body to different temperatures. So there is that element. When you get to air temperature close to 37 degrees and a very high level of humidity, then you reach a point where you cannot cool down, no matter what you do, because if you are in 40 plus degrees temperature and it's sufficiently dry, you can still sweat and cool down. But when the humidity comes up, then sweating is no longer effective, and actually start to become no longer effective at around 30 degrees of wet bulb temperature. That's the usual measurement of that is used in this context. So it's the measurement of temperature of a thermometer whose bulb is completely immersed in water. So it gives you an idea of temperature and humidity at the same time.
And of course, there are signs of heat stress, and an incoming heat stroke. Climate scientists say we're on track to increase by 2.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the year 2100. I hope it's fair to anticipate that systems may be in place by then to help people, I guess, avoid direct sunlight. But what kinds of ailments might be commonplace because of those much higher temperatures, you think?
When you have a wet bulb temperature over 35, then this gets really into dangerous territory. And by the time you reach 38 or so, then it's basically physically impossible for you to cool down. So in a sense, removing one part of the equation, of the heat balance equation, which is the direct sunlight, helps, but may not be sufficient to put you in safe territory. And if you look at what's happened in Europe, that is something that within the Copernicus Climate Change Service we monitor particularly accurately. And it was also in the Lancet Countdown report earlier this year. But you realize that in Europe, the heat related mortality has gone up 30% over the last 20 years. So it's not just an abstract element. It's not something that will happen in the future. It's already happening now.
Can you rank heat-related issues at medical centers as compared to other ailments, and whether you think those figures will rise in the coming years and decades?
Well, in a sense, the situation, the climate situation is getting worse in that respect. And if you look at the IPCC report, they state very clearly that heat waves are becoming more prevalent, they last for longer, and they are more intense. So given that there is a connection between these heat waves and heat-related deaths, then you can see the conclusion yourself. That said, it's not a done deal. There are many things we can do to mitigate that effect, reduce the level of warming by reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit in the atmosphere. Even without altering the pathway in terms of decarbonization, there are things we can do to reduce our vulnerability in this critical situation when we have heat waves. Certain categories of people, most noticeably the elderly and the very young and the people with pre-existing condition, are more at risk than others. So if you know with a few days notice that something, a potential critical weather or climate event is coming our way, then you can take action and protect those most vulnerable people.
Let's talk a bit about water. It is, after all, our go-to drink when the sun is bearing down. But if you're in Europe, you'd be faced with a tough choice. European scientists have identified what they describe as an invisible threat in the region's drinking water. The threat is called trifluoroacetic acid. It's a colorless but smelly liquid that can harm our skin, eyes, and mucous membranes. It's one of the per- and polyfluoroalkylated substances, or PFAs, that are used in everyday products and meant to keep food from sticking to cookware and make sofas and carpets resistant to stains. The problem is these chemicals are finding their way into our water, tap water and bottled water too. I reached out to the Pesticide Action Network, which analyzed 55 drinking water samples from 11 EU countries.
How dangerous is trifluoroacetic acid?
Well, actually, this is a question that can still not completely be answered today, and that's why our report raised a lot of concern. What we found out is a big quantity of this substance in the water, and sometimes in combination with other chemicals. So it raised a lot of question regarding the level of exposure and the cocktail effects with other chemicals. But so for years, the toxicity of the substance has not been assessed, but very recently we had some concerning evidence of toxicity on the livers and thus malformations. But this will be completely addressed by scientific regulators in the next months.
Do you have an answer in terms of how this would have gotten into the water?
Yeah, so this chemical is mostly emitted by two sources. The first one is PFAS pesticides, so forever chemicals that are sprayed on our fields, on our crops that we are then eating, but that also leak into water. And the second source are what we called F-gases, so all these cooling systems that you're gonna have for your fridge, for air conditioning, that kind of things. And then it gets into the atmosphere, and there is rain, and then it gets into your water.
This is a huge problem considering, PFAs are everywhere on almost everything. There's no real way to get rid of it all, is there?
Well, it's a difficult question to reply. I mean, you can always try to reverse the pollution that has been done, but I don't think we will manage to do it completely. And the longer we wait to act on the sources, the worse it gets. So I think the main message is behind our report, and if consumers wants to do something about this, it's just ask your authorities to do something about it. Ban PFAS pesticides, ban F-gases.
Are there not regulations across Europe that would have prevented something like this from happening? Runoff from agricultural lands that end up into waterways and tap water?
Yes, actually. So we have a pesticide regulation, and if the regulators had more carefully estimated the risk based on the lack of data they had and the great capacity of the substance to enter our water system, then they could have just prevented the authorization of PFAS pesticides that transform into TFA. So yes, definitely there is something that could have been done by the past, and that would have preventing TFA from piling up in the environment.
What made you check to see if there was this chemical in the water?
Because it's a chemical that is common to all four of the chemical pesticides. And because we knew that it's really easy to get into the water, and that now we have new toxicity evidence that raised some concerns. So our point is that if we find it so much, and if progressively we gain awareness and knowledge on its toxicity, then we need to do something.
What happens if large amounts of this chemical get into our bodies? Do we exhibit symptoms or signs that it's there?
So what we know from the scientific studies that exist is that the toxicity appears when you're exposed to high levels, which are not representative of what is happening, for instance, in drinking water. But the problem with TFA, so this trifluoroacetic acid, like for other four other pesticides, is that they stay in the environment. So they accumulate, and with time, the doses that you're exposed to is getting bigger. So of course, there is no possibility to rule out the risk for consumers, which makes the result of the report very scary.
Are there ways to get it out of the water?
Yes, there is one, but it's a very sophisticated system that is called reverse osmosis, and most of the companies, supplier companies, are not equipped with it for now. So this would require a lot of costs, energy costs, economical costs to get equipped with this. And then you have to think about it as cleaning the water end of the pipe, but maybe the solution is first to get rid of the sources, which are PFAS, pesticides, and gas, like ban those substances in the first place. And then if we have to clean the water, then it will have to be cleaned, but the water will be cleaned with TFA, but also with other good things. So we're getting tracked into a system where we will end up drinking artificial water, which is very sad.
Have you noticed your stress levels rising when it comes to the weather? Water shortages, wildfires, heat, hurricanes, the list is piling up. Well, a study conducted by multiple universities found that climate anxiety is on the rise. Eco-anxiety, eco-grief, climate doom. Many now say they can't get it off their minds.
Is there a noticeable difference between an anxiety that paralyzes you versus one that makes you want to do something to reduce your carbon footprint, like protest or change your lifestyle?
If you have a debilitating anxiety disorder, that would need, intensive treatment, professional treatment. If it's more of a lower grade, sort of persistent, non-debilitating anxiety, then often one can get assistance, from support groups and from joining groups that are proactive in the fight against climate change. Nature-based therapies can also play an important role. But again, we're talking about severity.
I guess it's not hard to understand the anticipatory fear of, powerful storms, flooding, drought in places prone to those events. But what about people you think in first world countries who experience none of those things? What does climate anxiety look like for them?
But there does seem to be a distinct difference between your affluent countries and your less affluent countries. So for terms such as solastalgia and eco-anxiety, they are more commonly used in mostly Western countries. Where your countries that are often more at risk to climate change, disasters, and are less affluent or poor, there are so many competing needs that the word climate change doesn't feature. Do you understand what I mean? It's more about survival on a daily basis. So the priorities are a little bit different. So yes, to try and answer your question, something like eco-anxiety is more commonly used in affluent countries.
I want to talk about the idea of this climate anxiety and maybe a hive mentality. People during these days seem to respond in groups to this. For example, protests across northern and southern hemisphere, people banding together to address their concerns. But when you bring up issues like these negative consequences that are tied to anxiety in general, what does the idea of suicide being a negative consequence or a possibility when it comes to extreme anxiety, when you tie that into the hive mentality of environmental anxiety, what does that mean exactly?
Look, I think the collective movements within the climate change field is good and it's positive, and we're seeing it start with in terms of the nexus of climate change and mental health. It isn't yet a formal diagnosis. I think what you're touching on is the aspect of stigma. There's more stigma in certain contexts in terms of mental health than other contexts. So, for example, within the African context, mental health conditions are often highly stigmatized. It's often more accepted within affluent setups as opposed to developing contexts where it's more stigmatized or it's seen as, you know, a demon possessing you or something like that. So a lot of work has to actually be focused on destigmatizing mental health and looking at support structures so that people can get the help they need. They mustn't feel too scared that they're going to be ostracized because they're feeling suicidal or depressed or something like that.
That's a great point, because anxiety, as we know, is quite an isolating situation for many people. Do you think collective action helps people not think about or not hurt themselves, I guess?
I think collective action can be a form of support. I think it can play a key role, but it also depends on, again, the severity. If somebody is severely anxious, and I mean pathologically anxious or pathologically depressed, they often will isolate themselves and start cutting ties with their communities, with their support structures. So it's important that significant others can also know what the signs and symptoms are of anxiety, for example, so that they can intervene if necessary on the individual's behalf. So we're looking again at a continuum of symptoms and the severity of symptoms.
Doctor, allow me to feed off your own experience in terms of your country of birth versus where you currently live. How would you describe the eco-anxiety someone in a country like India would experience versus someone in a country like the UK?
Well, obviously it's different because there is so much more lived experience of all of the ways that climate change affects humans. So whether you're considering droughts or floods or increased vector-borne disease, food insecurity, air pollution, all of those sorts of things are far worse in India. You know, the scale is something that is really not even properly recognized by the average person, I don't think, in the UK. Although there is a massive increase in levels of eco-anxiety and climate anxiety, even in Britain, the kind of anxiety is different. The levels are different because, of course, the lived experience is much greater in India. So largely what I would describe as global South countries. But there were very substantial levels of eco-anxiety in the global North as well. And that's what I believe is reflected both in India and the UK.
Do you think the way that the older generations experience eco-anxiety is significantly different to the way younger generations do?
I think there is a bit of difference. And indeed, much of younger people's eco-anxiety is associated with what they see as the indifference and the banality of response from older people, even within their own families and networks, and definitely from governments and system leaders to the whole issue. So I absolutely do think that children and young people experience it in a very different sort of way. There's a real sense of abandonment, a betrayal, anger, loss, grief that I don't think adults are even at this point in time beginning to understand the scale of. And we need to, we haven't studied the mental health impacts of the climate crisis as well as we have studied the physical health impacts. And I think much more effort needs to be invested in that area. But my guess is we do experience it differently in adults. Certainly, I can speak for the UK. About 75% of people in one response, one survey, reported feeling anxious. But I wonder what that's about. Obviously there are those who are very anxious, and I'd put myself in that category. And then what I see is those people who are somewhere in the middle, who will do a bit more to reduce their carbon footprints if they knew how to. And then there are definitely those who are, in their behaviors, very evidently quite indifferent to the whole agenda.
You brought up a great point in terms of how older people perceive the way young people experience eco-anxiety. Let's talk about Just Stop Oil for a second, very briefly. They express their eco-anxiety in a very unique way. It's annoyed a lot of people, but do you think the government, for example, understands and factors in this eco-anxiety into these young people's action, and hence find their actions justified in, for example, blocking roads?
The short answer to that, Reagan, is no. I think they don't get the measure of the anxiety and hopelessness young people are feeling. In fact, the disappointment among young people comes from the fact that their anxiety is met with disapproval rather than some attempt to understand it and recognize that they have a basis in that anxiety. They're right to feel anxious. We have a situation here where scientists, not characteristically given to emotions, are now openly, climate scientists are openly talking about feeling broken or feeling terrified and feeling fearful. Now, when else, have we heard scientists using that kind of language in personal interviews? So it seems extraordinary that we have this level of a kind of helplessness on the part of system leaders. It's almost as if apart from the ways that they're encouraging industry to become more green, they're not looking at how whole systems need to change in order to tackle the scale of what's before us. So there isn't that evidence that they are actually listening to young people, taking note of it, and behaving differently.
Well, despite the growing anxiety, there are steps we can take to relax and, dare I say, be happy. Now more than ever, finding ways to improve our mood and outlook on life can literally save us. Well, research suggests there are hacks to more happiness, like acts of kindness, increasing social connections, practicing gratitude, doing more exercise even, and focusing more on the positive. For some, understanding more about the problem can bring relief. One suggestion is to explore regional and global climate issues, their causes, and develop an environmental identity. Building up a set of values and a connection with nature can add to personal growth and help us appreciate the good that still exists around us. But counseling is another suggestion. Anxiety works in similar ways, whatever the cause, and a professional psychologist can help you develop the tools to adapt to difficult and overwhelming changes. Mindfulness meditation or cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, might be helpful approaches to processing fear. It can be rewarding simply to try to do what you can. For example, buying clothes made of natural materials, which can reduce microplastics that reach the ocean. Using phones and laptops for a lot longer and not feeling compelled to purchase the latest fad might lower demand on lithium and cobalt mines. Rewilding your property can help maintain local biodiversity, even paying more attention to what you buy. For example, locally grown fruit needs less fossil fuels burned than imported to reach your grocery store. And that is our show. But before I leave you, here are some images that might invoke some happiness for you. They're from our recent hike to Shafshat in northern Turkey.